All right, welcome to the Creo Collective webinar on minimal ecclesiology. I have a couple friends here with me today, Lucas and Jessica. Jessica and I have been working on a project, the MDNA project. If you've ever heard of Alan Hirsch, sort of his baby, MDNA and Forgotten Ways, if you've read that book, she and I are doing a lot of work on that project together, putting together an accelerator and test. If you've done the APES test, we're putting together a test for all of the different elements of MDNA. There's a book that we're working on, all that kind of stuff. So Jess is an incredible thought leader, a pot stirrer, somebody that loves to agitate, frustrate, challenge people toward growth, and a good friend, and a huge KC Chiefs fan. Right?
Yes, very much so.
And then I've got Lucas, and Lucas, it's funny how we connected because I've had like 140 people say, you and Lucas have to connect. You're going to like instantly be brothers. And then we finally connected. I'm like, it's all true. So if you've heard of Tampa Underground, Lucas is working with Tampa Underground. Did I miss anything, Lucas? I'm sure I missed everything.
Nope, that's good. I'm just to clarify, I'm a Tampa Brady Buccaneers fan personally. So
you're not a Bears fan?
I am a Bears fan because I moved from I spent most of my life in Illinois, so I'm a closet.
My husband
Bears
was a
fan.
Bears fan until they signed Cutler for that extremely insane deal. And we're like, no, they don't deserve to be cheered for. Like, we're done. Yeah, we broke up.
Yep. I'm a very public Tampa Brady Buccaneers fan, and I'm a closet Bears fan until they're relevant again in 2037. So
basically,
that's the year that Tom actually retires, right? 2037.
Right. Correct.
So we're talking minimal ecclesiology. So the question is, I think, what is that? What does that mean? What is minimal ecclesiology? So Lucas, Jessica, how would you answer that?
Jessica, I want you to go first.
This is we were just talking before the call officially started. So I'm a pastor of the Mennonite Church, leader of the Mennonite Church USA, which is, a relatively traditional church in terms of the most recently relatively traditional church. So I would say we're much more on the high church scale, very high in the what it means to be the church, like doctrine, rules, like all of the engagement stuff. And but originally we were a grassroots movement of leaders who during the Reformation wanted to follow scripture and wanted to follow Jesus, and decided that what it meant to follow Jesus was to make disciples, to gather together around scripture, prayer, worship. It really became, the movement grew because they did not need the hierarchy of the church. It was during the time of the Reformation. So they met around the table, and there at the time, evangelism, like just sharing scripture and sharing Jesus, was what they did. And so in my mind, minimal ecclesiology is the most easily replicable form of church. It's, how do we do worship? Or we worship together, we have communion together, we have mission together. And really that is really what it takes to be a church, like where two or more are gathered. There I am in their midst. And like, how do we make sure that is what is happening? Because just because you have a church service doesn't necessarily mean you have disciples. But how do we make disciples so that we have a church, right?
Mm-hmm.
Lucas, what would you say it is?
Yeah. So yeah, as you said, I hate borrowing business terms, but it is helpful to talk a little bit about like minimum viable product, right? Like like you're saying, what is the church in its most essential form, its simplest form? there's a lot of reasons to nail that down and to have a community that really understands that. One of them would be just a pragmatic reason, which is replication, which is what Jessica's talking about. It's like, it's the more complex your understanding or definition of church gets, the less replicable it becomes, and the less people that have access to starting and leading one, the more complex it becomes. So there's real pragmatic reasons to try to discern personally and corporately, like what's your conviction around ecclesial minimum. But then, as you discern that, there's also so much more around like missional engagement, spiritual formation, like the people who are involved in an ecclesial minimum style environment just have such a higher saturation toward spiritual formation. So many more pockets of the city are reached. So for us, and we're always careful about this, we have an ecclesial minimum with Tampa Underground, and as the executive director of the Underground Network, I work with underground sister movements in country and out of country, and some of them have come to slightly different ecclesial minimums. And that's important to us because we think so much of ecclesiology is contextual. That you guys work with Alan at 100 Movements. It's just the flow of like, let's nail down our Christology first. Let's focus on Jesus. Jesus sends his people on mission, and as we go about mission, we start to figure out how to be the church in a way that makes sense in missional engagement. So our ecclesial minimum might not actually be right for other contexts and other people who are trying to be the church in their place. So when I name ours, I just want to be careful that it's not like because it's the right one for everywhere and all times, all places. But in our context in Tampa specific, the ecclesial minimum that we've had now for about 20 years is an intentional family of people, not a see each other once a week and never see each other again, but like life on life family. So that's community, surrendered to the leadership of Jesus and fullness. That's worship, not banging on a guitar worship. It's Romans 12 worship, living sacrifice worship, and pursuing some piece of the mission of God in the world to proclaim and demonstrate the kingdom of God where he has sent you, to those who he sent you. So mission, so worship, community, mission. We would say when those three things collide, that thing is the church: worship, community, mission. And it buildings and budgets and programs and formalized leadership structures, even rhythms and sacraments and all that kind of stuff. That stuff is good and great and wonderful. It's desired but not required to be the church. And to Jessica's point, if you have an ecclesial minimum like that, and you start to like really nail it down, there are several things in your city and beyond that have a sign out front that says the word church, but it might not be, because those three things aren't colliding there. And then there's several people who are very like empowered missional disciples who are like just intuitively going on about doing things, and they don't call it the church. Other things don't call it the church, but we would look at it and say, that's the church. That's 100% the church.
Yeah, but I agree completely. I think there are a number of existing 501c3 entities that have buildings and have services that don't meet worship, community, mission element.
Yeah.
Either they have. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just like, they planted a worship service.
Sure.
And called it a church, right?
Sure. And I love that Jessica's coming from like a history of like the Mennonite movement. Like even if you think about the Wesleyan or the Methodist movement, like so many of these like world shaking kingdom impact enterprises through history started with a very minimal, simple ecclesiology that was accessible to the priesthood of all believers. But over time, things get bolted on, and things that worked 10 years ago, and we just kind of like close our fist around and we decide this has to be true for all times and all places. And essentially what's happening is the ecclesial minimum goes from 3 elements to 5 to 7 to 8. But sometimes people aren't consciously acknowledging that that's what's happening, that our very simple ecclesiology has grown to be much more robust and more complex and less accessible. And then they get stuck and they wonder, why aren't we replicating it the way that we once were? And go ahead.
One of the things, like, as you're saying that, I mean, there's two metaphors that come to mind, and so I like to call myself a disturber, because I feel like that's my job. That's my divine calling, is to disturb people's, particularly to disturb the notion of what church is, sure. Especially in my context. But the two metaphors are pruning and cancer. So let's start with pruning. So if, like, we moved into a place that had, grapevines, and if you really want to have good grapes, you prune back whatever bore fruit last year. And you basically, like, when you're really going at it, like, by the end of your pruning season, you cut back absolutely everything except for the base vine. And that's how you get good fruit. And so if you think about that as a church, like, even as a micro church movement, like, whatever is bearing fruit at the moment, you still need to intentionally prune in order to make sure that the main thing is the main thing, and that the vine is strengthening and building up for the next season of fruit, right? So that's the first metaphor that I think of. The second one is cancer. My brother-in-law is a nurse practitioner, and he was just talking. We were talking cancer, actually, but he was talking about how, like, cancer basically is when cells that should have died don't, and they just clump together, and they keep clumping on and clumping on. And instead of dying, they just stay on, and then they develop this mass. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, that's the problem with most churches, is we things that should have died, things that should have been pruned away, we just keep them, and we just let them grow and grow and grow. And then suddenly we have this mass on the side of the discipleship movement that really is slowing, like, making us unwell and making us not healthy. And so, sorry, go ahead, Lucas. But those are the two thoughts that came to my mind. Like,
no, it's
how
great.
do we make sure that this is healthy and core?
Yeah. And less effective too, right? Like, you end up with so much activity going on that people say, gosh, we would love the idea of being on mission in our community, neighborhood, workplace, whatever. But we got all these events we need to go to at the church building on top of work. And
sure. Yeah.
Just like, I think you've just overcomplicated things.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Think about what the church needs to be.
Yeah. Yeah. We were maybe like a year or two ago, we were at this future of the church planting think tank or something. I don't even remember who was there or what. I just remember we had this one conversation with there was a church planting agency out of the Southwest, Spanish River. Does that sound familiar? Like, they're and they were talking about planting all these churches, and it's a brilliant story, amazing leaders. I actually really appreciated them. But at one point I just asked them, you just said you planted 40 churches in 2018 and in these localities and stuff. That's great. But when you say we planted 40 churches, what did you plant? What were they? And they kind of started to describe it a little bit. It's like, we planted we planted communities that are trying to witness to neighborhoods, and of course there's a Sunday service involved, which is fine, but and there's 2 staff, and it has a budget and all that kind of stuff. And I started to ask, like, are there things that you chose not to plant? Like, are there ideas that people had that you said, that's not what we replicate? Or I was basically just trying to ask them questions toward, what is your ecclesial minimum? Like, what are you motivated? When you say your church, what are you planting? What are you multiplying? And a lot of times multiplying agencies, they have never actually sat down and clarified that, because the assumption is copy and paste. It's like what we're doing it's obvious that what we're doing is what we're asking people to go and do. And there has not been just a moment of like acknowledgement or sobriety around the parameters of what they would or would not multiply and replicate. And so I almost feel like I don't want to say it's less important what ecclesial minimum. It is important what ecclesial minimum you land on, but I just think it's important for everybody to have one in the first place, because if you don't, you're just going to copy and paste the thing that you do. You know what I'm saying? Like this is.
Well, isn't that what Bill? I mean, so when I met you, it was through Bill Kochner and Cookie. That's his nickname, right? Cookie. But
I have never once called him Cookie, and now I'm going to do it forever.
Well, that's Alan Hirsch's nickname for him is Cookie. Like Alan has a nickname for everybody, and his is Cookie. But
I call him Cookie.
I call him Cookie. But no, so Bill. But he said, like he would always say, begin with the end in mind, and like, sure. And I think. So my husband and I moved here 3 years ago to the Kansas City area. We were just like, you know what? I was done with traditional church model, and I was like, hey, you go buy a business, I'll just plant a church, right?
Yeah.
And so of course it was like, we were here a year and then COVID hit, so things are kind of moving slowly. But when we first moved here, my husband, like, we're planting a church, so he kept finding all of these disgruntled church people. And he's like, hey, they're interested in joining your church. And I'm like, dude, no, stop. Because he's an evangelist. He's very good at inviting people to things. I'm like, no. Like, we have to begin, like, we got to be very purposeful with how we begin, because we will reproduce whatever we start with in mind. And so, So if I wanted to plant a church that was just a worship service and gather all of the disgruntled church people around me, that would be really easy. But what would I be replicating? And so it's like, to begin with, okay, so what is
boy, doesn't that sound like a fun bunch too?
Yeah, seriously. I'm like, they're unhappy with their church.
Let's get a bunch of pissed off religious people together. I'm sure that's
exactly. And I'm just like, but that's my denomination, when they plant churches, that's typically what they have in mind, right? Is like, we are going to plant a church because all of these other churches are failing. So we're just going to gather all of these unhappy people in a church and expect it to work. But yeah, so being very clear about, okay, so our ecclesial minimum, what does fruit look like? What is the fruit we want to replicate look like? And what kind of disciples? In my mind, it's always like, what does the disciple look like that we are producing as a body? And so, like, starting with discipleship, starting with, this is our expectation, what a disciple of this body looks like as they are sent forth, And so it's so important to start with the end in mind.
Yeah.
Well, this is why I think, Jess, Sims and I were talking about at the university level, like people being trained for a world that no longer exists.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. You got people being trained to open up Blockbuster videos.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Just like you're completely out of touch. Like, what would it look like to actually see people experience community?
Yeah.
Be a family together, live on mission.
Yeah.
Right. Be centered around the person, the words, the works, the ways of Jesus.
Sure.
The very, very different question than, how do we get official, and how do we get people to show up to this event?
Yeah.
And
follow your paperwork and get your constitution in order. And I was just having a conversation with, I was like, oh, like, have you thought about what you want them to be like when they're together and gathered, and how do we, so the church I grew up in, they're very apostolic, very evangelistic. They were one of the first to jump onto the 40 Days of Purpose. They went to Saddleback to be trained, and so they were really big into that, and they like grew and grew and grew, and then they were wanting to move towards missional, and they have seriously, so they've tried to start all these missional communities with the idea of micro church, house church in mind. And the barrier that they keep coming into is that they have a church of consumers. Like, so their church, like the DNA of the church is come and see, right?
Yeah.
Come and we will provide for you this religious experience. now that they are wanting to shift towards a missional movement, they're really struggling to find people to lead. They're really struggling to find people who feel like they have the capacity to lead and to build leaders who will disciple makers who will make disciples. They're really struggling because they were based on this consumeristic model, attractional model of the church, and it doesn't translate. It doesn't translate to missional community or to this. And so just that constant awareness of, okay, what the DNA is going to be there once you start it.
Sure.
So what DNA what's the healthy DNA that will be reproducible?
It's really important, because I do think there is a way that that leaders could become excited about a minimal ecclesiology, but either from the beginning or along the way kind of convert to seeing minimal ecclesiology as a stepping stone to a bigger church expression. Because every single person on this call has a little mega church pastor in your heart that you need to decapitate. Like we've been formed by the West and by celebrity and fame in Christian America for 30 years. And we all have bad, we're all on a little bit of a disentangling journey here. So I just think sometimes, like if you actually see more than like just the pragmatic values to minimal ecclesiology, but you're doing it from a place of theological conviction around even like belonging and community and spiritual formation. And there's so much more to it than just the pragmatism or something like that. And you decide like, this isn't a stepping stone to some other thing. This isn't like a phase one planting strategy or something. This is it. This is the end in mind. And we're just going to replicate these as like rapidly as we possibly can. If that's like you're saying, Jessica, it's like if you can clarify that from the beginning, it's really, really helpful for the long-term sustainability of the group and some of those consumers, right? Because whether anything you're planting, whether it's house churches, micro churches, missional communities, mega churches, everybody runs into this stone wall called consumerism, and it nukes whatever you're trying to do. And one of the ways you kind of come at that is through covenant community, and that covenant community being based around clear communication and expectation and commitment to some of those DNA values. So I totally agree. I mean, at the end of the day, we're really like obsessed with just a New Testament imagination for church planting. Like the Acts 16, the planting and development of the Philippian church in Macedonia, like they are trying to go. They're trying to go east. Paul and his crew. The Spirit of the Lord prevents them, whatever that means. They land at Troas, and they're like, we're trying to go east so hard. And then the Lord's like, go to Macedonia. It's west. Go west. They land. They try to go to all the synagogues. No luck. Take a break out at the water. Find Lydia. Lydia has this radical conversion. Then they're on a walk, and they find a demon-possessed teenager. Deliver her. Then they get arrested for delivering her. They go to jail, and the jailer and his whole family come to the Lord. And then at the end of the chapter, it's like all these people. So jailer and his family, recently delivered teenager, and Lydia gather at Lydia's house, and they're like, all right, cool. Church planted, moving on. There's no, it's
effortless.
There's no elders. They haven't even put elders in place yet. So one of the kickbacks we get is like, that's great. Worship, community, mission, that's fine. But it's not a church until there's elders in place. Not in Acts 16. Like they circle back later. Right. So, that just like you said, effortless. That's a good word. It's like, it's simple. It's minimal. It's fully the church. And yet in some ways it can actually be more potent, more powerful, sometimes more costly, committed, sacrificial than alternatives, right? That are bigger or complex or something like that. I want people, when they hear the word church, to think of that.
Yes.
And when they hear the term church planting, to think of that. Because if that's what they think of when they hear if they have that's a New Testament imagination. And most people, when they hear the word church or the concept of church planting, what their imagination conjures is not New Testament. And what their imagination conjures is something that is inaccessible to them. Like they could never start it. And they're hoping that they find somebody who could start it. But if they had a New Testament imagination for church and church planting, they would immediately think, oh yeah, I could do that in my living room.
Well, it's really about making sure that it's whatever we have is so in Ohio, back when I was in Ohio, like what we started, like it was really amazing because we had such a high church mentality of what it was, what we were setting out to do, right? And we made it so simple, like to start all of these little missional groups. We made it so simple that that suddenly they're like, oh my goodness, I've been wanting this my whole life, but I never thought that I knew enough or I could do enough, or I was, like they felt so inadequate to be a part of a missional leadership team, right? But because we made it so simple and then we set it to a rhythm, and so we're like, okay, this is the rhythm of what it means to be the church together, setting it to a season. This is the season of rest. This is the season of production, like, so making sure that people have a sustainable model of what it means to be the church together. So that they're not burning out trying to make it go on their own effort. And I think that's key, is like, to protect us from burnout, we have to develop rhythms that are healthy. We have to make it sustainable. We have to make it replicable. And it really is like, it just takes a little bit of forethought.
Yeah, it's that simple, reproducible, transferable.
Yes.
And what you just described, Lucas, is in Acts, is why the church went from 20,000 people to 200 million. From 100 AD to 300 AD. Explosion. So really, like, what we're trying to do is not create movement. It's to remove all the junk we've put in place that's blocked it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We're not the movement makers. The Spirit will do that pretty well. We just get crap in the way. It's our problem. How do we get rid of the blockages? Right.
Or live with margins. Like that's the other piece that, like, I'm constantly like, okay, do you have enough margin in your life? Actually, Acts 16, I was reading that today, Lucas, which is kind of it's making me like, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is the story of today's Acts 16. But do we have the kind of margin in our lives and in our schedules, especially for us I'm not a type A person, by the way, but for type A people who are like, okay, I've got a schedule and I got a plan and I got this thing down, and like, do you have room to be knocked off course? Like, do you have room to have that unexpected person come into your life and then you pour into them, like, are we giving ourselves the margin that it takes to build a church that's effortless? Because I think that, when we're efforting, that's my new word, efforting, like we're trying to make this thing happen on our own power. And then we're missing all of these other opportunities to head to Macedonia. Right.
Yeah.
And we're like trying to figure out why we're not fruitful.
Those stories are so telling too. I mean, what you read in Acts, Lucas, and when we talk to people, you can tell when people start talking about Jesus, or when people start talking about their neighbor, or when people start talking about other people that are a part of their community that are like family to them, and they're telling you stories and they're excited whenever you ask them about church. But whenever you are talking to people about church and they start bringing up services or sermon series or things like that, it's an entirely different conversation. So you can tell when people see church as, this is a family that I belong to. And here are some stories of transformation that's taken place, in my work building, or, with my friends at the Renaissance Fair, or, this is what's happened at UPS, right? And you start hearing all these stories and you go, wow, this is really cool. And that's how they view church versus someone who goes, well, we just started a study in Judges, right? We got these people, we got this great graphic, we put flyers all over the post office. You're like, I think we're having completely different conversations.
Well, one of the struggles that I'm having right now, in working, because I'm thanks be to God, I'm on the margins. Like, so I live in Kansas City, far away from any Mennonite congregation, so I can do my own thing, which is life-giving. But I still work inside the system, and one of the biggest barriers that I have is for the people who know that minimal ecclesiology, that micro church, house church, that is really a movement that we need to move towards for the post-congregational Christian, right? I just read that. I'm like, oh yeah, that's it. It's post-congregational Christian. So for those of us who know this is where we need to go, but they've been raised in the church and they've been raised in the traditional model of the church, like for people to unlearn that mode of church, like my husband's one of them, like bless his heart, like he just to unlearn what it means to be the church program, to be the church building, to be the church, all of that stuff. It's a hard road to hoe. And so just to put that out there, that for those of us who do bring with us a traditional church background, the ability to unlearn what it means to be, or unlearn what we think it means to be the church in order to relearn what this new way of being church is has to be very intentional.
We've coached and consulted friends who are trying to do micro church network, house church network kind of stuff in other cities. And we've seen more and more over the last 2 years. The pandemic, COVID just drove prevailing model and traditional church ecosystems to really start asking these questions in more serious ways, because they just realized that at least in a pandemic, there has to be a change. I don't know how long that interest will persevere once we kind of come out of it, but we saw so many people say, yeah, we're doing microchurch. And essentially what they were doing was like a sermon and a worship set inside of living rooms. And our feedback started to become like, if you're just going to try to do the Sunday service attractional thing, but in smaller ways, that's actually worse. That's like the worst of your three options. Like you could do like your attractional Sunday thing with 200, 300 people, or you could actually do something like grassroots and communal and embodied and missional in nature, missionally oriented in living rooms. This is your worst of those three options. Don't do this. So that's sort of that, but that comes from sort of like the difficulty in disentangling and unlearning. And you've got baggage from we all do. We have baggage from like our previous experiences that we carry on our back into the journey of innovation. And we just try to bolt it on, to some of these new things. And, I totally agree. And there was a very popular house church movement out on the West Coast that came in again in the ecclesial minimum conversation. They had existed for 2 to 3 years. They had a big reputation. I'm not going to say their names. You would all know. But we had a conversation. They flew out to have a conversation with us because they were like 3 years in, and they had this expectation that they were going to grow like 20% every year by year. And they were in year 3 and they only had like 12 house churches or something like that. And they were disappointed. And they were asking us just to like try to get under the hood with them and just give them some feedback. And so we're just like, all right, what's going on? Like, let's try to understand your ecosystem and how it works. And essentially they were communicating publicly and internally even that they had a sort of a worship community mission ecclesial minimum, which by the way, if you go and look at all these platforms, a lot of people do up in and out, commune with God, commune with others, reach the world or something, like this. Yeah. This is a very common kind of, we all say it different, but there's a lot of people who have landed on that. And they said, yeah, that's our that's our ecclesial minimum. That's what we're trying to replicate. But then you just ask a few more questions. And essentially what they were doing was they were saying, What they were trying to replicate was house churches. Every church had to be meeting regularly in a house. Their mission had to be the surrounding neighborhood of that house. When they gather, they need to be doing Bible study. They needed to be doing specifically discovery Bible study. They only, I don't know anybody on this call or whatever, so I'm about to jump on a landmine. I don't care about it, but they said only men can lead. Men have to be elders of the house churches. And so we were just asking all these questions. They're answering all these answers. And I said, 20 minutes ago, you said you had a 3-part ecclesial minimum. I just asked you 5 questions, and I just calculated a 9-point ecclesial minimum. That what it means to be the church in this ecosystem is to meet in a house under the authority of men and to study the Bible this specific way. And the only missional output you have is the neighborhood around that house. So now, if you want to do that, if you feel like the Lord is leading you to do that, then good, do it. God bless that. If like you're in submission to Jesus, not some, whatever pragmatic understanding or whatever.
You might not want to call it minimum though.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. It's like, first of all, it's not a minimum. And if that's what the Lord's leading you to do, God bless you, please do it. But don't expect to grow 20% year by year because you've so shrunk. You've so shrunk who can lead those. You've shrunk who has access to lead something like that.
And the imagination of what you could do.
And the imagination of what you could do. So basically what in our language, we would say that the root of every microchurch, like the basis of every microchurch, is calling, hearing from the Lord, like hearing from the Lord about to whom you're sent and how you're wired and who he has destined you to go and reach. And the microchurch kind of forms on that journey, like as you're running that way. But if you say top down, all the microchurches have to look this way, there are going to be people in your ecosystem that feel very called to do something that doesn't fit that. And you've actually cut them off from being able to lead. Yeah. And they're essentially going to be the people who have to leave your ecosystem to go do the thing that God is asking them to do. And they're going to bother you and they're going to frustrate you all the way out. But so that again, these are just like cause and effect of ecclesial minimum conversations. And we try to be very open-handed with people. Like again, the thing that you feel very led and called to do, you should do that. You should listen to Jesus and obey, but you should have a self-awareness about the cause and effect of some of the decisions you're making around ecclesial minimum and have the right expectations.
It takes a particular kind of leader though, to be able to lead a movement oriented. And of course, I mean, we're thinking movements, right?
Yes.
So it takes a very particular kind of leader who has the ability to let go of that control,
right.
to cultivate leadership in everybody.
Yes.
Yeah. In the Lydias among us, who happens to be a woman, but it really does take that ability, the humility, the ability to cultivate and then to just let go. And I think that for a lot of churches and organizations, that's why the ecclesial minimum is never a minimum, is because we want to control what the end result looks like. And I don't think movements happen that way.
Yeah.
You can't control the end of the movement because the Holy Spirit's in control. And
totally.
Yeah. Like it's impossible.
Yeah.
That's why I think the control accountability matrix, you want low control, high accountability, or I'd prefer the word support.
Yes.
Right. Like a high level of support, and just we're there to help you process and figure out, next steps forward, but low control. Yeah.
And Mike, you were right earlier when you said like so much of Christian leadership training and leadership imagination, just about every Christian leadership book you would pick up from the 80s, 90s, early 2000s is training people on how to lead blockbusters, and part of that training mechanism is part of that paradigm of Christian leadership for 30 years, longer than 30 years, is one person gets the vision. And they get some title that's like visionary leader or lead pastor or something like that. And the goal, in order to maintain unity and the keys to unity and scale, is to align the entire community to that single vision.
Yes.
And it creates entire structures, and the entire infrastructure of the church is aimed toward assimilation strategies, right? To the kind of vision statement of the whole ecosystem. That is a way to grow a really big, that's the way to grow like a really big church. I mean, I don't know if you guys, if you guys saw, I don't know, if you didn't see this, I'm going to make you like wake up in the middle of the night angry, and I'm sorry, but there was maybe 6-7 years ago, there was a story that came out that, at Elevation Church, Stephen Furtick, like the kids program at Elevation Church had these coloring programs where the kids like had these coloring pages from kids church or whatever. And the coloring pages were literally like a picture of Stephen Furtick on stage saying, "We trust that God gave Pastor Stephen a vision, and we will submit to Pastor Stephen's vision." And they're like coloring these coloring book pages or whatever. No, 100%. It's horrifying. Don't go look it up. I ruined your life. But that is, so that's like alignment to one vision, alignment to one, assimilation to one thing.
Disgusting.
I know it's hard to swallow. But to Jessica's point, if you want to move toward movemental ecclesiology, like actually, if you want a movement, what you're asking for is a lack of control. If you want a movement, but you want to hold on to control, you're schizophrenic, you're psychotic. If you want a movement, you're asking for a lack of control. And a movement leader has to be able to emotionally adopt a posture of, I release control of having a vision in the first place. My vision is that all of you would have your own vision and that we would help you pursue it. I'm not going to go up Mount Sinai, hear from the Lord, and come and tell you what he said. I'm going to tell all of you and show you how to go up the mountain yourself.
Exactly.
And we're just going to help you do it and come alongside you no matter what he says. And to give you a minimal ecclesiology framework that helps you to pursue that in a way that cultivates a profound, earth-shaking witnessing community among those to whom you've been sent.
So Lucas, I'm going to push. So I just led a group a couple weeks ago and leading the same kind of conversation. And so this pastor, who's a really good friend of mine, but also a control freak. So he pushes back at me and he's like, yeah, but some people just, don't have, they're just not mature enough to be left in their own, to lead in their own way. So what would you say to him? Like, some people, there needs to be a gatekeeper, because not everybody is capable of leading a group.
Yeah.
Or shouldn't be leading a group. What would you say?
Yeah. I would say that there maybe are certain competencies that are helpful to large scale leadership. But the most fruitful microchurches that I can name in the Tampa underground ecosystem are led by people that are, in the eyes of any other Christian leader, very immature. And we even have a microchurch leader that has like real diagnosed mental health issues, and is leading one of the most fruitful and effective microchurches in the whole ecosystem. She, by the way, would be disqualified from leading in almost any other church system that I've engaged with. And that would be a dramatic loss to the kingdom of God. She, anybody that interacts with her around here has grown accustomed to it, but any conversation you have with her, she just emotionally unravels. And because she feels overwhelmingly about everything. And that thing that people look at and they say, she's kind of unhinged. Like, it's, she would just be completely like, she might actually be harming people or leading people astray or not being able to like ground people or something like that. The very thing that people are looking at as a disqualification is actually what makes her qualified to lead in the sector that she's in, which is, she's like basically the Mother Teresa of the single mom community across Hillsborough and Pinellas County in Tampa Bay.
Awesome.
And those women are not going to, there's a dozen other agencies
Yeah.
They're not going to these other agencies because they're connected to this woman.
Mhm.
And the fruit of that ministry is so evident, so obvious.
Strength is made perfect in weakness, right?
Strength is made perfect in weakness, exactly. And there are
Yeah.
things, there are things that, you know, New Testament, thorn in the flesh, like there are things
Oh,
that
yeah.
people have, like thorns in their flesh, that God has actually granted them as a way to like lead them to depend on him and to flip upside down the script of like strength and weakness in our world, and that God would get the glory. But we look at those thorns and we actually make them disqualifying, you know, and it's, we, you know, even in our own like trying to identify leadership potential, like what you know, you're like scanning a community and you're always trying to think who's the people we should really invest in, and the people that you choose to invest in are the people who you subjectively decide are the people who have potential. If we don't evaluate what we're deciding is leadership potential, we hardwire our own biases around who we invest in. And we could even be deciding, scanning our relational networks and deciding that people are disqualified from my investment as a potential leader because of a thorn that God has given them that I've decided to disqualify for some reason. You probably handled that conversation very graciously, Jessica.
Oh, I mean, like he and I, we are accustomed to going rounds, but
sure. It's good to have friends like that. But I at the same time, to his point, I do think like somebody who's in like an executive director seat of like a large scale, like $100 million nonprofit or something like that, and they just have to like manage a whole lot of tasks and plates and stuff like that. I do think there are like certain kinds of leaders who are capable of doing that and doing it well. And there's other leaders who wouldn't be. So it's more like let people empower people to lead and lead in the lane that they have. And at the end of the day, let God decide their capacity, not me, you know, like God is empowering them to lead. Let's align with what God wants to do. And God might actually have a higher capacity for leadership for them than we could imagine or think. So
maybe they'll just be multiplying freaks. They'll go,
yes,
okay,
totally.
I got capacity to really invest my life into about 8 people at a time. And then after that, it's just, I get super burnout. So
yeah.
I'm going to hang out with 8 people for a year and I'm release them, and then 8 more for a year and release them. They're just freaks. You just let them go, and it doesn't have to be. You know, people look around and they compare themselves, and they feel like they have to copy paste the other stuff they see, and you lose all that uniqueness for sure. I'd like to open up some Q&A for everyone else, but for those of you that are tuning in later, thanks for checking this out.